Thank you so much, Professor Browne-Marshall, for joining us today for this celebration of the Constitution. I really appreciate you giving us your time.
Thank you.
And I appreciate that you're going to answer some of my questions, because I know that you've probably answered these questions a lot here during this anniversary year of suffrage, and so I appreciate your patience. I'd like to start, if it's okay with you, with when did African American women begin to organize into a suffrage movement? Was that prior to the Civil War or post the Civil War? Or like, when did that sort of start happening?
Well, when you think about the fact that Africans arrived in the Virginia colony in 1619, a colony, as you know, that was founded in 1607. So less than 20 years later, we have African men and women who had been kidnapped from Angola, Africa, had made the passage through the Atlantic Ocean's Middle Passage, were captured on the high seas by an English privateer, and then made hostage and kidnapped again and taken to the Jamestown settlement. And so when they arrive in August of 1619, men, women, and children aboard that ship, we have the entree of diversity. And the reason why this is important is because they're Native Americans, of course, you know, the Powhatan, the English, and all the different ethnic groups within the UK at the time, and these African women. And men can vote only if they're landholders and of high esteem. So women are watching the political process. White women and African women have been watching the political process since that time. So you think about these Black women have been watching men vote since 1619. And so as they've watched men vote, they've always had ways in which they held the community together through informal ways, and had to lobby, as women all had to lobby during that period of time in informal ways, because women were thought not to have a brain that was capable of handling the vote. So there's always been this background of informal activities, about pillow talk, lobbying outright, you know, mechanisms of protest. So by the time we get into the drafting of the US Constitution in 1787, its ratification, we are seeing African women, even enslaved women, watch the political process. So we had women like Mum Bet in 1780s and 90s actually bring a lawsuit demanding her rights under the Massachusetts Constitution. They are actively a part of the legal process. They haven't been able to take a formal role in the legal process, in the political process. And so by the time we get to 1848, with the Seneca Falls coming together of white women in Seneca, New York, and their presentation of the Declaration of Rights, we have Sojourner Truth, who has already walked away from slavery and is a known preacher, is a known abolitionist, as well as, and this is, remember, this is an African woman who has walked away from slavery, and she at that time, in her own way, is a suffragette. These Black women are not invited to the meeting in Seneca Falls that is considered the chartering of the feminist movement, but Frederick Douglass is there. His wife is not with him, who's African American, but Frederick Douglass is the one who informs the white women in their Declaration of Rights that if your declaration does not include the right to vote, then you are missing out on one of the core principles that is going to elevate you to equality. And so it's as early as 1851 that Sojourner Truth gives her Ain't I a Woman speech in Ohio at a white feminist convention, because by this time the white feminists are focused on equality, but that equality does not include Black women. So there are a number of Black women during that time who are fighting for the right to actually have their voices heard. Maria Stewart, for example, in Boston, is fighting for her right as an African woman to have a woman's voice heard. So there have been informal and formal mechanisms for women to petition in their own way their right to vote, and then informal and formal mechanisms for Black women to not only petition to the world writ large that they have equal rights, but to their white sisters to say, you know, why are you not including us in this fight?
Can you tell me more about the relationship between the white suffragettes and the African American suffragettes, or those the women and the tensions of the time. Can you tell me more about that? Because I don't really know much about that.
Well, what we have are white women who are still based in a white male patriarchy. Their husbands, fathers, and even their sons have rights they do not have. They have no right to own property in their own names. They have they're considered children. All women are considered children, and no women have the right to vote. And so their rights come through their lineage or their marriage. And because we have enslavement at the time that's broken by law, the right to lineage, inheritance, for example, if a white man rapes or has a sexual relationship with a black woman, they produce a child, that child has no rights of inheritance from that white father. So they've broken the lineage that you would have of rights of voice of this woman through her male counterpart is broken within the black community by law, but it still is engaged in the white communities. And so this woman then takes her rights through her male, and we're dealing with that same issue today. So this balance of they want equal rights with the male, but they don't see themselves as wanting to embrace their brown sisters in equality as well. So there's this tension between the African woman who's saying to her sister, her white sister, wait a minute, aren't we in this together? And that's why Sojourner Truth says in 1851, ain't I a woman? If we're talking about women's rights, ain't I a woman? And also at the same time, talking to men, including black men, saying, ain't I a woman? And didn't I also earn my right to have equality with you? So the black woman has forces against her on all sides, the white woman, the white male, sometimes the black male, and she's got to rise up as best she can. And so we have many instances in which these black women then begin their own organizations, because the white women's organizations are race-based, and they are not allowing these black women to join. And that's not stopped the black woman before. We usually ask, please, can we be a part of something? And then when we've turned down, it's like, okay, fine, we'll go do our own, and we'll make sure that we are covering our own bases as persons, but also as members of a community in need of advocacy. And so that black female advocate has been there during the time period of slavery. And there have always been two groups, the enslaved Africans as well as the freed Africans. And the freed Africans could work in a more formal way to protest for their rights. But it's always been with a sense of you're protesting during the time period of slavery for equality as a human being. And you think about this, these black women who are free are protesting for their enslaved brothers and sisters, and also having to fight with white women to be seen as equal to them, even in their sense of freedom and education, because black women were getting higher education as early as the 1840s at Oberlin College in Ohio. So we have this fight that goes through the time period of slavery. And this becomes very important, because when black men fight in the Civil War, they win their freedom. And Frederick Douglass talked about the ballot or the bullet. They won their freedom. And Abraham Lincoln said, President Lincoln said, but for the African soldiers who were freed by the Emancipation Proclamation and then fought for the Union, the North would have lost. So it was understood that they had earned their rights as full citizens for the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery, the 14th Amendment giving citizenship at birth, equal protection and due process. But it's the 15th Amendment, and this is the 150th anniversary of the 15th Amendment this year, as well as the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. It was the 15th Amendment that gave black men the right to vote, but that so infuriated white women, because as the debate was going toward the 15th Amendment's ratification, the white suffragettes were saying, how dare you give black men the right to vote before you give it to black women? And so this issue was something that was the rub for white women that continued to cause even a deeper schism between white suffragettes and black suffragettes, because the white suffragettes were insulted by the fact that the 15th Amendment gave Black men the right to vote, and that a Black person, male or female, a Black person would have more rights than they would have in their own society. And they began to start a racist propagandist war with their Southern sisters in tow, against the Black male vote and the use of the Black male vote in elections.
I did not realize that there was such a division between those groups. And I'm fascinated by sort of the idea that for African American women, it sounds to me like there's not just one issue here, that there's a multitude of issues that they are trying to solve. Can you expound on that a little bit? Because it sounds to me like they're worried about a lot of different things, as opposed to white women seem to be focused mostly on the vote. And maybe it's because they had some of those other rights already. Can you tell me more about that?
Well, I think even if you look at it from the white woman's perspective, it was very class-based. So you have fewer concerns if you're a white woman who's upper middle class or wealthy. And remember, the rights stem from the husband's wealth. And if she inherited wealth, even then her husband controlled it. And then you have like those working class white women who were more concerned or had more a common concern with the African American woman, because those working class white women had to deal with issues of poverty, of health, of education, all of those issues that are workaday issues that they didn't have the money to make go away. So when you look at the Black woman's issues and her concerns, you can see one after the war ended in 1865 was her own personal safety and the safety of her family, trying to keep her family alive and well. And that was very important. You have, for example, in 1870, the first Black US senators. You have the first Black US representatives. So there were over 4,000 Black males in positions of state, local, and federal government between 1870, when the 15th Amendment was ratified, and 1890, up until the Mississippi Plan. At that same time, you had Black suffragettes who not only had suffragettes organizations like the Colored Women's League or the National Association of Colored Women or Ida B. Wells Barnett's Alpha Club that she started in Chicago, but those organizations were not just for the vote, they were also for the social welfare of the community that needed cleanliness. Sanitation issues were appalling during that time in these tenements. You have also the Black migration, of which my family was part of one of the Black migrations, the Exodusters coming up from Kentucky, my family's history in the 1880s going into Kansas. So you had this reclamation of family members. So you had Black women trying to locate family members who had been sold away or lost. To this day, yesterday, I just talked with a family member, a friend who found a family member that had been separated by slavery. And they found each other through DNA and an ancestral search engine. So when we start thinking about right after slavery, you had Black women thinking about educating those children, because literacy was so high, because to read at the time period of enslavement was a fatal mistake. It was against the law for an enslaved person to learn to read. So they were trying to educate themselves as well as educate the next generation. You also had lynching as an issue. You had the reformist movement taking place in the white suffrage movement. They wanted to reform child labor laws in the white suffrage movement. So did the Black suffragettes. Because each thing that was happening in the white community, as they say in the Black community, when white people have a cold, Black people get pneumonia. So if it was tough in the white working class communities and the white suffragettes were working on those issues, it was tougher in the Black communities. One of the last areas, of course, we have to talk about would be that of the lack of criminal justice protection. And so you had these Ku Klux Klan vigilante groups and these other terrorist groups terrorizing the Black communities because of the vote. because Black male vote could change the tide of an election. And so in 1873, you had the Colfax Massacre in Louisiana, in which Black men were coming together to try to figure out how they were going to use their political power. White men hear about this and they attack the building, shooting into it. Nearly 200 Black men died in that massacre. So there was also just trying to maintain your farm, trying to maintain a livelihood, being cheated at every turn and corner. So there was so much for the Black woman to do, and in the South, but also in the North, and then at the same time during the wave of migration into the cities and trying to have some type of stabilization of the family in city environments. So there was much to do in addition to the vote, but they knew without the vote, they wouldn't have a voice in the politics of how funding was going to be distributed. They wouldn't have a voice in trying to unelect these sheriffs, allowing the terrorization to happen in their communities, and they wouldn't have a voice as to how the government should best serve their communities. So they knew that the vote was all important, and that was primary in many of the ways in which these organizations would come together and the missions that they had.
Oh, I see. So the fundamental basis of doing everything else comes from the political power of being able to vote, and being able to vote as a group, being able to drive an issue, which is still true today, right? That in your single vote, you may not make a difference, but in your aggregate, votes can elect a new person into office or change a law or do whatever you want to do. So I see.
Yeah, but that also in turn triggers voter suppression, and that triggers the murders, and that triggers the fear of Black power and Black political power. And because the Black woman had to organize her own organizations, her own entities, her own social welfare agencies, informally outside of the government, that is the strata and foundation that has led to the power of the Black woman to this day. We already had those organizations. So those suffragettes organizations become the foundation for the ability to organize a community, the ability to bring together the vote and to focus that vote in the ways in which the community was most in need. And that threat of the Black woman's organizational skills that she used to help Black men gain power after 1896, when Plessy versus Ferguson was a Supreme Court ruling that then brought in racial segregation as the law of the land. That was then a trigger to attack Black men as well as Black women. So that political power then was crushed. And I give this one example I think is very illuminating. In Louisiana itself, because that's where the Plessy versus Ferguson case arose in New Orleans, there were over 100,000 Black men registered to vote prior to the Plessy versus Ferguson decision. By 1900, that number was 5,000. That was the response to the Black power and the political power that Black men had at the time, and the opening up of the floodgates of terrorism that was allowed by the Supreme Court with the Plessy versus Ferguson segregationist decision. And so that power of that Black vote was crushed almost to the point of non-existence. From those 4,000 plus Black men in political offices, we then end up with 2 or 3 altogether in political offices after Plessy versus Ferguson. And the attacks were not just on Black men, but the attacks were also on Black women. As the suffragettes movement began to take steam and speed, it was seen that the Black woman's vote added to the Black male's vote meant more political power. And so the Black woman came under attack as well.
So how did they suppress the vote to that? I mean, 100,000 to 5,000 is a terrifying level of suppression. How does that work? How do you suppress a vote that way?
Well, they were organized in what they were doing. In 1890, it's called the Mississippi Plan, in which Senator and then Governor Vardaman comes together, and he basically says, this is not about the vote, this is about the N-word. because that's what it was all about. When they created the grandfather clause, it says if your grandfather didn't vote before 1866, then you couldn't vote. And they knew that the 15th Amendment was ratified in 1870, but on its face, and that's why these race neutral laws are just as deceptively racist as these other laws, because they know when they're writing them, the focus of the law is to undermine the Black vote. Even without putting race there, they know by writing the law in that way, it was meant to undermine the Black vote. Also, the literacy tests, that now your person has to take a test in order to register to vote to see if they're qualified. The US Constitution gives the states the right to set the qualifications for a person's right to vote. Yes, the Constitution gives that power to the states. And as long as it's not race-based on its face, then it's considered race neutral. But the way it is applied is race-based. And so they would apply this literacy test in a way in which they would say, write an essay on a provision of the US Constitution. If you can imagine giving your students such an exam, and then have them write this essay on some arcane line in the US Constitution, and then not show you when they grade it what grade they received. Just say, oh no, you failed. And also say you have to go to the registrar for voters in order to take this test, and knowing if you show up when you go home, you will be evicted if you're a sharecropper, your cattle will be poisoned, your barn will be burned, and your wife or daughter are raped, and their father hanged or lynched. And the last part is the poll tax, that you had to pay a tax in order to register to vote. And all that was decided in an 1890 Mississippi plan. And then all the other state conventions met, and they also instituted a very similar plan. And that's why by the time we get to 1990, to the 1900, you're able to have wiped out 100,000 registered voters in just one state. And then if you replicate that over many states, you can see how they crushed the political power and the momentum of the Black vote.
So when does that start to be fixed?
Is it? Has it? We have to think about the US Congress passed civil rights legislation in 1866, 1870, 1871. They knew the states were not going to protect the rights of Black citizens. They knew this as early as 1866. And so they passed civil rights legislation. So when you hear people bringing a civil rights action, this is early as 1866 that the federal government passed federal legislation to protect the civil rights of African Americans. And so that legislation was part of some of the legislation that was brought by the NAACP, which was formed in 1990. Their first case is a voting rights case, and that's US versus Gwynn that went to the US Supreme Court in 1915. So it was litigation, legislation, protest. And I say this is the trifecta for social justice: litigation, legislation, and protest. You have that with a vision of where you want to go, and that makes social change. All students of social justice need to know that is how change took place. There were litigated cases by the NAACP. There were legislative anti-lynching proposed legislation, as early as the 1800s after slavery ended. Calls for reparation were as early as 1880, where people were calling for reparations and bringing lawsuits and trying to pass legislation for reparations. But there was also protests. And so there were protests in the streets. And this is another illuminating fact about the conflicts between the white suffragettes and the Black suffragettes. Frances Willard, who was a leader of the temperance movement, that was anti-alcohol movement, and also a suffragette, and Ida B. Wells Barnett, who was a Black suffragette, who was the one who investigated lynching, and people like Alice Paul, white suffragette, and Frances Willard, and others of that nature were trying to court the white Southern vote by saying that if the Black man was raping white women, and you needed to pass more laws and not give any more Black people the right to vote because they were abusing or didn't use their right to vote. Ida B. Wells Barnett investigated and found out in the majority of cases of lynching, there was no involvement of a white woman at all. It was based on jealousy. It was white men jealous of Black economic progress. It was based on keeping Black people in their economic and social and political place. It was based on intimidation. It was based on a number of things. As a matter of fact, when you think about it, leading into the passage of the 19th Amendment, in 1918, Stella Young and Mary Dennis, two Black women in Florida, lynched. You have 15,000 Black women, men, and children participate in a silent march down Fifth Avenue in New York City in 1917, protesting lynching. Ida B. Wells Barnett has shown that the lynching was not based on the rape of white women. It was based on the ability of Black men to take a life and do it so with impunity, because prosecutors were not prosecuting and sheriffs were not protecting. And so Emma Hooper, for example, is lynched in Louisiana. An unknown Black woman found hanging from a tree. Mary Turner, and many people can go in 1918. Now look at this, we're leading closer to the momentum of the passage of the 19th Amendment. And you're seeing more and more Black women being attacked, raped, and lynched and assaulted. Mary Turner's case is one of the most repugnant. She's 8 months pregnant. She is lynched in Lowndes County, Georgia. She is hung, her belly is then cut, her fetus is taken out, and the men stomp on the fetus. Her picture of Mary Turner, this is how proud these men were of this act, these white men. They took a photograph, that photograph is available right now on any search engine that you look for, and you look for Mary Turner, and you can see her hanging body. So as we go into 1919, we begin to see, for example, the Red Summer of 1919, prior to the passage of the 19th Amendment. You see the highest point of race riots against Black communities, the highest point of lynching. All of this is culminating in trying to crush Black political progress that would now include Black women, and white women fall in that line. And one thing Frances Willard said early on in the latter part of the 20th century, 19th century, she says the safety of white women, of childhood, of the home is menaced in 1,000 localities. Now, this is after the Black men have gained the right to vote. And she is saying this as a white suffragette, that if you give Black women the right to vote, after the Black men are menacing our communities, you're making it worse. So they actually did not want to see the Black women receive the right to vote when they did. They wanted to figure out a way in which that 19th Amendment could be segregated so there would be no more political power given to the Black communities.
I don't know how to react to that, because it's so awful. And it's so, it feels like there's lessons there to learn for going forward, for how we can move forward as a society, how we can move forward and empower people in American society who are not empowered now. What can we do going forward? What's the lesson here?
One lesson is we have to learn from the past. There's a Ghanaian word, Sankofa, and you learn from the past to better understand your present, to go forward in the future. Kamala Harris is on the ticket. And she's not the first Black woman to be a vice presidential nominee. Actually, that was Charlotta Bass back in 1952, who was on the Progressive Party's ticket as a vice presidential nominee with a white male leading the ticket. With Kamala Harris, we want to make sure we're going to repeat a mistake of having white women not support this Black woman because she could be in the White House before a white woman is. Are we going to repeat the same sense of, if it's not me first as a white woman, then it cannot be any woman? The sense of the white suffragettes was, as a white woman, I should have mine first. I should be in the lead. It should always be me first. And white privilege is born in murder. It's not born in the acquiescence of any person of color handing over their power to the white community. It was with murder and oppression and legal finagling that would undermine the progress of other groups of people. If we're starting out and we're trying to work for the same means and end, why is it that the sense of a Black woman being in the lead goes to almost challenge the identity of whiteness? And if whiteness is based only on being better than somebody of color, then people need to look in their own hearts and figure out, why their identity is so in tune with being, in some sense, superior to someone else, where by record, there's no true sense of that superiority. And I think this is a time in which women could take the lead by showing men that we can come together and understand that we share more in common than we do in opposition. And I think in this particular election year and going forward, as we look at what Alice Paul wanted, and I like to give credit where credit is due, the Equal Rights Amendment was never passed. The Equal Rights Amendment was presented by Alice Paul shortly after the 19th Amendment was passed in 1920. However, it's continued to languish and is now seen an uptick. And there are only 2 states necessary, in Virginia being one of them, in making this decision of whether or not the 19th Amendment will be added to our US Constitution. There are Black women who are leading this fight in the state legislators, legislative bodies in Nevada, as well as in Virginia. We can come together and show white men, Black men, and other men of color, and other men of reason, and other men in all aspects of life, how it's done. So the lesson that can be learned here is the female lesson of coming together, because women do things because we come together to get it done. And Black women vote at the highest rate of any group. We know, based on those organizations, I've said before, how to have community organizations. We've been able to do all of this by ourselves for the most part. Can you imagine how powerful we would be if white women joined and other women of color joined together, and we put an agenda together that was more inclusive and more holistic, the way women know how to do it?
I think we'd rule the world.
And we need to rule it well. We don't need an iron fist, Margaret Thatcher, ruling of the world. We need a ruling of the world from a holistic standpoint of inclusiveness, and women based on the sense of family. How do we define that family from a political standpoint? If we broaden that tent and define the family holistically, we'll find that we have much more in common. We can get so much done, and it could be such a powerful, unified voice that could make great changes in the world.
Thank you. Thank you for ending this on a happy, strong note. That's our message for our young women, for our old women like me, for all of us to get out there and do it together, because if we do it together, we can lead and do the right thing. Thank you so much.
Thank you.